Now that we've installed a forest, it's time to add a domain controller to our forest. So in order to do that, we have to really walk back through the steps that we did earlier when we added the forest, which was essentially adding the role of Active Directory. So once the role of Active Directory, those files have been installed on this computer, we can then take it one step further and start configuring it. And when we configure it, we're going to choose to add a domain controller to an existing forest. So we're going to use the ADatum forest that we talked about a little earlier. So we're going to select Add a Domain Controller to an existing domain. And the moment we do that, it's going to go out and figure out what domains are out there, and it's giving us the option of choosing adatum.com, which is one of the forests in our network. We will also have to give it credentials. And this has to be done by someone who has permission to add a domain to a forest. So who would have permission to add a domain to a forest? That would have to be the enterprise admin. When we get to the screen that asks us for our domain controller options, we have a number of options we can select. And these are very similar to what we saw earlier when we were adding our new forest. So we can have a DNS server created alongside this domain controller if we'd like. So the two would be on one system. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a really good option, especially for small to medium-sized networks. And if you don't already have a DNS structure set up, this is actually really nice. You will also note that you can make this computer, if you'd like, a global catalog server. And if you decide to do that, that would be very helpful also in a single domain environment. It's recommended to have the domain controller and the global catalog server on every single system. So every domain controller in your domain would have a global catalog server. You also will note that you could turn this into a read-only domain controller. And you can do that simply because we already have a forest. So I can choose read-only domain controller, especially if I'm at a branch office that needs a domain controller and I don't really have a place to lock it down. So we'll talk more about the read-only domain controllers as we move forward. Note too that it's going to add it to a site, and by default you get the site default first site name. This is very easily selected if we'd like, especially if we have only one location. This makes sense to simply go with the default first site name. But if I have multiple locations, chances are you're going to have multiple sites, so you'd have to pick from the list which site you wanted to add this domain controller to. You can also do that after the fact if you'd like. What you will also note is you will have to put in your password for the Directory Services Restore mode, and you can kind of see that that's already been typed in for us, so hopefully we know what that was when we set it up for the forest. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And we get that same DNS options page again. Notice with this one it wants to know if we want to update the DNS delegation. And we get that same warning because it's trying to go to the parent and adjust the parent's DNS delegation. So in most cases we're not going to handle it here. We could handle which DNS server is going to handle which client requests for queries through the DNS server, and that'd be a better place to do it than here. So we can come back to this through the DNS server. We have the option of installing this domain controller from media if we'd like. This is a really good option, especially if we have a domain controller that is across a WAN link. Maybe we have a domain that we split across multiple sites. Maybe one site is on the West Coast, the other side is on the East Coast, and honestly for them to be able to replicate on a 15-minute cycle or less across a WAN link, that might not be the optimal way to set this up. So we could install from media if we'd like, which would essentially be backing up a domain controller and putting that on media, taking that over to the other domain controller that we'd like to install from, and then letting it be replicated and synced up with current information as soon as it comes online. So that's a really good option if we like to do that. And if we don't do that, then we have to set up that domain controller by communicating with other domain controllers across that slow WAN link. So this might be a really good option. We'll dive a little deeper into that as we progress further here. Note too, it wants to know where we want to replicate from. So what other domain controllers are out there that we might want to pick up information from? And we can tell it any domain controller, or we can be very specific because maybe there's a domain controller that's as close to us and we want to pinpoint that domain controller as being the one that sets our domain controller up with the records that it needs to move forward. So we can pick that or anyone. I really only have one other domain controller out there, so either option would be fine. But like I said, if I had a list list of domain controllers, I can pick the one that maybe was the least busy right now, closest to me, and I could pick that one to get my information to start off my domain controller from. So I'm just going to keep the default on this. Then I'm going to click on Next. And again, it wants to know where I'm going to store my NTDS file, my database file. It wants to know where I'm going to store my log file, where I'm going to store sysvol. And this would be the local copy that this domain controller has. And then that information, of course, could be replicated with the partners that are out there. And the C drive is actually pretty good unless there's an overriding reason to change this out for security reasons, or maybe the C drive, you don't want to store anything on it because it has limited space. So there could be a reason to change this out. But in a lot of cases, this is going to work for us. When we get to the review options, this is really going to show us all the options that we've selected as we've gone through. And we could review it from here, see what we've set up. If we made any mistakes, we could click previous and go back through and make some changes. Some of them are actually best if we fix it here rather than later. You'll also note that you can create a script. You can view it and then you can export it. And this, of course, would be our PowerShell script. And then we can use this as a way to maybe recreate this same domain controller on other systems. We could also use this as a way to maybe get this system to be back up and running as a little bit of a rescue to get it configured. So the script is a good idea to have handy. So we could choose that option too. Then we have our prerequisite check, and it's going to go through to make certain that we can actually install Active Directory on this system. It'll take a little bit to kind of run through, and it'll give us an option at the very end to say whether or not we want to reboot the server. And you can see there's a couple options on there that will be rebooted, that will need a reboot if we select the install option for this. And as you scroll on down, you're going to see too that you have our prerequisite check completed. So we can see that it's done, and then all prerequisite checks have been passed successfully. So we can essentially now simply install Active Directory and get this system up and running as a domain controller in our network.